Good evening, everyone. By way of explanation, we had a technical difficulty and didn't have sound on the recording at Fringe tonight, so I'm home and I'm recording the sermon again for you. Today, this afternoon, we had 3 baptisms at Fringe and they were wonderful. And even the water was warm. And it was a great blessing. We had a good turnout of people, came to support, it was beautiful. Hence my preaching. I got told, we're going to baptise people. At the end of last week, I got told, and I thought, my sermon, will it fit? And then the Lord was gracious and got me to look up a few verses from what I intend to preach. And there it was, a reference to baptism. And so, if in anything else, I hope that can be an encouragement. The Lord knows every last detail and He has it all planned. So, with no further ado, let's just have a look at the passage. It's Luke chapter 7, and in light of the baptisms, let's just look at verse 29 and 30 first. The people that heard him and the publicans, they justified God, being baptized with the baptism of John. Now that was the baptism we did today, the baptism of John, for the remission of sin, right? Aligning our lives with the life, death and resurrection of Jesus, baptizing them into the waters, raising them up, being the significance of to newness of life. And where it says about they justified God, that means they agreed with. They said it was the right thing to do, that they should be baptized. Okay? That's what that's all talking about. Then the Pharisees, they rejected the counsel of God and refused to be baptized. And that's because they were religious. They didn't recognize Jesus for who he was. And they held to their self-righteousness. And Pharisees were known for that they prided themselves on that they tithed, they gave of their tenth, and they had moral excellence. Remember that as we get into the next few verses that we're going to cover. And that starts down in verse 36. But just before we go there, I'd like to share a little testimony. Years ago, I found myself in a place where I believed I had grieved the Lord. I'd grieved the Spirit of God. And I found humility. The Lord graced me with sufficient humility to come to Him and say, Lord, if I'm going to grieve you, I'm asking that you'd take the very strength out of my physical body to get my attention so that I'll stop. It'll pull me up. And it mightn't be anything to rejoice over, but the Lord was faithful. And a number of times I've experienced where I started to buckle at the knees because the Lord had done as I'd asked. He'd taken the physical strength from my body. Now that I would ask you to remember in light of He has authority and ownership over every facet of our lives. There's nothing that is ours, it is all His. So moving into our passage, verses 36 through to 50. There was a Pharisee, one of those religious people, and he came to Jesus and said, Jesus, I'd like you to come and eat with me. And of course he had an audience of his other fellow Pharisees there so that he could be pumped up in front of them. To have this supposed great prophetic prophet, wonderful, religious teacher that had risen, that they didn't really recognise. And so Jesus, being His gracious self, He came to dinner and He sat down. And in the same town, there was a woman who was known as a sinner. And she heard that Jesus had gone to this Pharisee's house. So she went there. Now, it doesn't specify what her sin was. And I don't mean to give her a bad name, but it's suspicious that she may have been a prostitute. So You can imagine the dynamic there. She turns up and her means of earning an income is immoral, so she's hardly likely that she would tithe out of those finances that she got, if there was anything worth being able to tithe out of. And her level of morality would have been looked upon as lower than the dirt on the ground. So in the light of sitting anywhere near the presence of the Pharisees, it would have churned their stomach to think, how could we have such a vile person in our presence? But she comes, and as she turns up, she stops behind Jesus and starts to cry. And she cries so bitterly over her sinfulness that she was aware of, because she knew, she had a revelation of who Jesus is, the Holy Son of God. And she wept powerfully, and she wept on his feet to wash them. And then she dried the Lord's feet with her own hair. Instead of getting a cloth or even using part of a garment, she dried them with her own hair of her own body. And then she proceeded to kiss his feet. And the passage actually records that she turned up with an alabaster jar of fragrant ointment. And so she took that ointment and she anointed Jesus' feet. Now, as I said before, having this woman in the Pharisees' presence would have been enough of a disgust. Having her serve Jesus like that was just too much. And this Pharisee that had invited Jesus to come, in his own heart, not speaking it, but in his heart, he said, if this man was truly a great prophet, he would know the quality and character of this woman, and he wouldn't let her touch him. Now Jesus, in his graciousness towards this Pharisee, instead of destroying him, or like we may, if we had the power that Jesus had, we may in disgust. No, Jesus in his mercy and his grace turns to this Pharisee and he says, Simon, I have something to say to you. And this Pharisee, in his false humility, says, oh, say on. Say, tell us. And Jesus said, he starts to describe a situation of a creditor, somebody who was wealthy, and two debtors, two people that needed money, and they came to this creditor and said, can you loan us some money? And one owed this creditor 500 and the other 50. And Jesus says to Simon, this Pharisee, he says, who would love the most if this debt was forgiven? And that's what happened. When the creditor couldn't be paid, when these two people that owed money realised that they couldn't pay the debt, he graciously forgave them their debt. And Jesus says to the Pharisee, who would be the most appreciative? Who would love the most for that? And Simon turns around and says, I suppose the one who'd been forgiven the most. Now, before we go any further, as I said about my own strength in my body that the Lord graciously took from me to help me learn to not grieve him, he owns everything. We own nothing. You may think, and we may think, oh, I own a house, or I own my health, or I own my brilliance, or I own my car, I own my position at work. No, we own nothing. Jesus owns everything. And we have nothing that we can come and pay our debt, just as those two people couldn't pay their debt. Now, if that irks you, I would encourage you that you need to deal with the Lord about your pride. So, having said this to the Pharisee, Jesus then turns and looks to the woman, but speaks to him. And the passage continues on and says, "Simon, see this woman? I entered into your house and you gave me no water to wash my feet. Now the task of washing a guest's feet was given to the lowliest servant to wash feet." And this Pharisee, he didn't even give Jesus any water to wash his own feet. Son of God, not just another Pharisee, the Son of God wasn't even given water to wash his own feet, let alone that the Pharisee should have known his position. If he was truly godly, he would have known that I'm in the presence of a King of heaven and I should be humble. I'm nothing more than the lowliest servant. I should wash his feet. But Jesus says, you didn't give me any water to wash my feet, but she has washed my feet with her tears and wiped them dry with her hair. He then goes on to describe the next thing that the woman had done. He says, when I arrived, the custom should have been that you gave me a kiss on the cheek, but she hasn't stopped kissing my feet since she walked into the place. He then goes on and says, no, I came and you didn't anoint my head with oil, but she has anointed my feet with this precious ointment. And then Jesus turns around and says, wherefore I say, her sins are forgiven, which are many. They're forgiven, for she loved much. But to whom little is forgiven, they love little. See, the Pharisee didn't realise that he owed everything to Jesus. He had nothing of any worth. His moral purity was nothing in the sight of Christ. So Jesus turns to the woman and says, your sins are forgiven. Then the rest of the Pharisees, that just stirs the hornet's nest. They think, who is this man that he thinks he's got the right to forgive sin? Jesus doesn't address that. He goes on and says to the woman, thy faith has saved thee, go in peace. And I want you to make sure you capture, she came and she was an emotional mess. In her awareness of her sin, she wept so bitterly that she washed Jesus' feet. Don't ever let yourself be deceived by being whipped up in an emotional whirlwind and I must be saved now that I've been so emotional. No, emotion won't save you. Emotion won't save me. Faith, as Jesus points here in the end of verse 50, your faith has saved you, go in peace. It's not an emotional roller coaster. Faith is solid. Faith is balanced. Faith is stable. It doesn't waver and wander. True faith, it's like the woman's faith. She came against all the opposition of all these Pharisees, a woman that was known as immoral. She came and bowed down at the feet of the only person that could truly forgive her and could give her salvation, and that was Jesus. Just as the same for you and I, it's Jesus. Now I'd like to pick up on the three things that were done and just point out a little the dynamic there. The three things are: one, she came and she washed his feet with her tears and used her hair as just utter disregard for herself to accomplish the task of washing his feet as a lowly servant, as opposed to the Pharisee who did nothing. She kissed his feet. So the first one is humility, that she washes his feet. The second one is kiss. She kisses his feet. The Pharisee didn't even give Jesus a kiss on the cheek. She kissed his feet, which speaks of an overwhelming desire to be in fellowship with Jesus and the way of Jesus. You know, as Jesus is the way, the truth and the life, she aligned herself in humility to wash his feet. She aligned herself with him in desire, in passionate giving of herself to kiss his feet. She didn't respond to him in her old manner of immorality. She, in humility and in true purity, kissed his feet. And as the passage says, she came with the alabaster jar in the first place with the intention of making a covenant of sacrifice. The covenant of sacrifice was in the oil, in the ointment. And that's the third thing she does. And she does that again to his feet. Not like the Pharisee who was to anoint his head. She anointed his feet. So in everything it was in submission, in an obedience, and as I said, humility, desire, and a sacrifice unto the way of Jesus. And that's, that's what we've got to do. And that's what Jesus says of her, because you've loved me much, because you know that you've been forgiven much. And then he turns and says, he just makes the perfect finish to it by saying, your faith, which is something Jesus had given her, obviously, because God gives us everything we have, but the measure of faith that she had has saved you. And then, for you who are troubled, for you who are buffeted by what's out there in the world around about you, Jesus says, go in peace. If you receive salvation, there's peace to be had. And I know the day where I haven't had peace, but if we walk with Jesus in the way, in humility, in the way, washing his feet, being willing to serve, as you've done it under the least of these, you've done it under me, Jesus said. So as we're willing to serve in humility other people, as we're willing to want relationship, a pure relationship with people, loving them, as Jesus said, if you love me, you'll keep my commandments. You'll love the Lord with everything, and you'll love your fellow man as yourself. Love, relationship, that passionate desire, and in sacrifice. As we do it unto the least, we do it unto Jesus. So we sacrifice ourselves. And we sacrifice of what is our wealth. So they're the 3 points. I pray that that will be a blessing to you. I pray that it will strengthen your faith. I pray that it'll overcome the up and down over the waves of emotion that's so prolific out there in our world. Our TVs spew out emotional programs. We go up and down on emotion so much. We're supposed to live in faith. Nice and stable, nice and consistent, and victorious. So I just pray that you'll be blessed through this week, that you'll be uplifted, you'll think on the truths of this message. You'll test what I've said if it's the truth, and you'll be strengthened by His Spirit to go forward and see a difference and to touch other lives effectively for His glory and His glory alone. Thanks for being with us. Have a brilliant week. Bless you. Bye.